What would you do if you paid for a first-class seat and someone looked you in the eye and said, "You don't belong here"? What if the crew, the very people meant to protect your dignity, sided against you? And what if, in that moment of humiliation, you had the power to ground an entire airline? This isn't just a story about a seat. It's about Dr. Julian Carter, a calm, steady black CEO who built his empire from scratch. On Flight 628, bound for Los Angeles, he was told to move aside, to disappear quietly, to accept prejudice disguised as procedure. But Julian didn't yield. What began as a stolen seat spiraled into a confrontation that shook the aviation industry, toppled reputations, and birthed a movement that spread across airlines, hotels, and boardrooms around the world. How does one man's refusal to stand down ignite a global fight for dignity? What price are we willing to pay to defend principles that should never be negotiable? Stay with us, because this story will change the way you see every seat, every boarding pass, and every act of bias. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to light. The sliding glass doors at Denver International Airport's Terminal C opened with a soft hiss. A wave of cool, conditioned air washed over the crowd streaming in from the bright morning sun. The smell of roasted coffee drifted through the concourse, mingling with the faint metallic tang of polished floors and luggage wheels. Dr. Julian Carter adjusted the strap of his worn leather messenger bag on his shoulder and stepped forward. At 45, he carried himself with a kind of quiet solidity, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that drew it anyway. People often looked at him twice, sometimes curious, sometimes skeptical, sometimes with that silent question lodged behind their eyes. What's he doing here? He wore a navy hoodie, pressed chinos, and soft brown loafers, the look of a traveler who valued comfort, not the uniform of a man who had, just 2 days ago, signed the final papers on a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. That deal had given Carter Aviation Group a company he had built from one leased jet 15 years ago, controlling power over several regional carriers. But here, in the hum of Terminal C, he was just another passenger boarding a flight. Announcements echoed overhead. Families corralled children. The rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases blended with the background buzz of conversations. The voice on the public address system cut through it all. Sky Continental Flight 582 to San Francisco is now boarding first-class and business-class passengers. Julian's phone buzzed in his palm. He swiped past a stream of unread emails. Legal drafts awaited his signature in San Francisco documents that would finalize yet another chapter in his company's expansion. But for now, he pressed the screen dark and slipped it into his pocket. Work could wait. He joined the smaller stream of passengers heading to the first-class boarding lane. Here, the atmosphere shifted sleek luggage, tailored suits, Rolex watches, quiet tones. It was less a line and more a club, unspoken rules binding those who seemed like they'd always belonged. Julian inhaled slowly, centering himself. He had traveled first class countless times. He had purchased his seat with his own money, just like every other passenger. And yet, experience had taught him dignity was never guaranteed, not even here. A young gate agent greeted him. She wore the crisp navy uniform of Sky Continental, her smile warm and genuine, not forced. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. You're in 2A today. Window on the left. Perfect weather for flying." Julian returned her smile with a nod. "Thank you." The small kindness steadied him as he scanned his boarding pass and stepped down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the air smelled faintly of champagne and leather. The first-class cabin stretched ahead, lined with cream seats, polished wood accents, and soft lighting that mimicked the morning sun. The quiet murmur of passengers settling in was punctuated by the clink of glasses and the occasional laugh. Julian walked down the aisle, eyes searching for 2A, his seat, his space, his contract. He reached the row and stopped. Someone was already sitting there. A woman in her late 30s reclined comfortably in 2A, legs crossed, a half-full flute of champagne in one manicured hand. Her golden hair was styled perfectly, and a designer handbag rested on her lap. The overhead bin above bulged with her Louis Vuitton luggage, spilling into neighboring space. She didn't look up as Julian paused, her attention fixed on her phone as though the cabin belonged entirely to her. Julian's eyes flicked down to his ticket again. 2A. Confirmed. No mistake. He drew in a breath, steady but firm, and stepped closer. "Excuse me, I believe this is my seat." The woman looked up slowly, like he had interrupted something sacred. Her blue eyes scanned him, hoodie, chinos, messenger bag, no visible luxury logos. Then came the smile. Thin, polite on the surface, but steeped in ownership. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I don't think you belong in first class." The words landed like acid, invisible, but burning. Julian's chest tightened, not with anger, but with weariness. He had heard those words before, in countless variations, on playgrounds, in boardrooms, in restaurants where the host glanced past him for someone who looked like the reservation. The phrasing changed, but the message never did. Not you, not here, not this seat. He extended his ticket, steady as steel. "I have 2A. There must be some mistake." The woman let out a laugh, light but hollow. "There's no mistake. I always fly first class. Maybe you should check back with the gate. Sometimes people get mixed up." The emphasis on mixed up carried weight. Julian's thin smile never faltered. "Then perhaps you wouldn't mind showing me your ticket." Her fingers tightened around her champagne glass. "I don't have to prove anything. This is my seat, and I'm not giving it up to someone who clearly doesn't understand how first class works." The cabin seemed to hush. A few heads turned. Phones paused mid-scroll. The unspoken script was clear. The black man would yield. He'd move quietly to another seat, avoid disturbing the first-class peace. But Julian Carter had not built an empire by yielding to what others thought he deserved. He stood tall in the aisle of Sky Continental Flight 582 boarding pass, still in his hand. And in that moment before the crew arrived, before the confrontation escalated, before the world would hear the name of Seat 2A, he knew one truth with absolute clarity. This time, he would not step aside. Julian remained still in the aisle, his boarding pass balanced in his hand, the weight of the moment pressing into the quiet air around him. The woman had not moved an inch. Her champagne glass tilted slightly, as though the very idea of being asked to vacate a seat was beneath her. Passengers nearby sensed the tension. Some leaned slightly forward, pretending to adjust their seat belts. Others lifted their phones just a fraction higher than before, their cameras quietly recording. The unspoken drama was not new, not to Julian. He could almost hear echoes of his past, times when someone's glance or tone had suggested he was out of place. He had learned to walk through those moments, to carry himself with the steadiness of a man who refused to be defined by other people's limits. Yet here, in the narrow aisle of a first-class cabin, with his seat visibly occupied and his right dismissed as a misunderstanding, he felt that familiar weight of history pressing down again. "Miss," he said evenly, "if you'd kindly show me your boarding pass, this will be settled." The woman looked at him with icy composure. "My name is Victoria Langford," she announced, as if her name alone carried authority. "I'm a Platinum Elite member. This is always my seat." Julian kept his voice calm. Status doesn't override a confirmed seat assignment. Victoria tilted her head, her smile sharpening. You really don't understand how this works, do you? She gestured vaguely toward the overhead compartments stuffed with her designer luggage. This is my section. People like me are placed here for a reason. The words landed heavy, not shouted, not crude, but insidious. The kind of phrase that slid under the skin, implying belonging for some and exclusion for others. Julian's jaw tightened. A ripple of motion appeared from the front galley. Clara Monroe, the lead flight attendant, stepped into the cabin. Her Navy uniform was immaculate, her stride brisk, her expression polished with the kind of customer service smile that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. She approached Julian and Victoria with professional grace, though the flicker in her eyes betrayed calculation. "Good afternoon," Clara said, voice smooth. "Is there a problem here?" Victoria was quick to respond. "Yes. This man thinks my seat is his." She put deliberate emphasis on the phrase "this man," letting it hang in the air like an accusation. Julian offered his boarding pass without hesitation. Clara took it, examining it closely, her brow furrowed as though verifying something of enormous consequence. "Seat 2A," she murmured. She then looked at Victoria. "Miss Langford, may I see your pass?" Victoria gave a dismissive wave. "I don't have it out. I told you, I'm Platinum Elite. I always fly in this section." "That's proof enough." Clara nodded slowly, her body language suggesting that the explanation carried some merit. She turned back toward the galley and gestured discreetly for another crew member. A moment later, Ethan Park, a younger flight attendant, appeared with a tablet in his hand. Clara spoke softly to him, but the cabin was so hushed that her words carried. "Check with the gate. See if there's a duplicate seat assignment." Ethan nodded and disappeared. Victoria leaned back in the seat, took another sip of champagne, and smirked. "I'm sure this will be cleared up in no time. Some passengers just don't understand the system." Julian stood motionless. The calm in his face belied the tightening in his chest. He could feel the eyes on him, the quiet judgment of strangers who had seen this script before. The black man was expected to yield, to accept inconvenience for the comfort of others, to avoid becoming a disturbance, but not this time. Ethan returned, his expression uneasy. "Ms. Monroe," he said carefully. "The system shows Mr. Carter is confirmed in 2A. Ms. Langford appears as an upgraded member without a seat assignment. Julian could have left it there. Let the truth stand." But Clara Monroe wasn't finished. "Sir," she said gently, "we do have an excellent seat available in premium economy. If you'd be willing to accept that, we can avoid delaying departure." The cabin seemed to shrink. The suggestion hung in the air like a verdict. Move to another section, step aside quietly, pretend the error was his. Julian's thin smile never faltered. "I appreciate the offer," he said evenly, "but I purchased 2A. I intend to sit in 2A. Ethan's lips pressed together, his eyes flicking nervously between the two passengers. Clara's professional smile seemed to freeze in place. "Mr. Carter," she said softly. "Miss Langford was seated first. It would be best to cooperate." Julian's voice carried a quiet authority, each word deliberate. "The Department of Transportation requires airlines to honor confirmed seats. Being seated first is not grounds to displace a paying customer." A faint gasp echoed from somewhere behind him. Someone whispered, "He's right." Victoria rolled her eyes. "Are you trying to lecture me on airline policy?" Julian tilted his head slightly. "No. I'm reminding you of the law your airline is bound to follow." The air felt dense, as though every molecule was pressing against the walls. Clara shifted her stance, but instead of ending the dispute, she said, "Sir, please provide additional identification. We need to confirm this properly." Julian's heart clenched. Identification. After his ticket had been scanned, after his name was already matched to the system, in all his years of flying, he had never been asked for anything beyond the boarding pass. Additional identification, he repeated slowly, his tone edged with steel. Clara's face remained composed. "It's procedure in disputes." Ethan avoided Julian's eyes. "It's just to clear things up, sir." Julian reached calmly into his wallet, sliding out his driver's license. He handed it over. Clara scrutinized it carefully, her lips moving as she read the details aloud. Julian Marcus Carter. But the ticket says Julian Carter. "My middle name." Julian answered firmly. "Marcus is my middle name. Julian is my professional name. Both are valid." Victoria leaned back with a smirk, her voice dripping with false magnanimity. "I don't mind if he sits here." She pointed toward a seat at the far end of the cabin, right beside the lavatory. "That one's empty." Clara turned to Julian. "Would that be acceptable to you?" Sir Julian's reply came instantly. "No. My seat is 2A. I'll sit where I belong." Victoria's smirk vanished, replaced with thinly veiled irritation. She leaned toward Clara, her voice low but sharp enough for Julian to hear. "This is absurd. Look at him. He doesn't even look like he can afford this seat." The words cut through the cabin like glass scraping metal. Silence fell. A woman in row 4 whispered, "Oh my God." Julian closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He felt the heat of humiliation pressing against his ribs, the weight of centuries condensed into a single cruel sentence. His mind replayed it over and over. Doesn't look like he can afford it. He opened his eyes, his expression calm but unyielding. He had been pushed into a corner, and he knew what had to come next. Victoria's words had not just questioned his right to a seat. They had questioned his very dignity. And dignity was the one thing Julian Carter had never been willing to compromise. The cabin had grown so quiet that Julian could hear the soft hiss of the air vents and the faint rustle of newspapers being folded back into seat pockets. All around him, passengers held their breaths, watching as though a courtroom had suddenly sprung to life inside the aircraft. Victoria crossed her legs again and lifted her glass, sipping with exaggerated calm. Her expression radiated triumph, the kind of satisfaction that came from believing the system would always bend to protect her. Clara Monroe shifted uncomfortably, but her training anchored her to the company line. She smiled, even as the corners of her mouth trembled. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "we need your cooperation. Otherwise, I'll have to involve airport security." The words were meant to sound routine, but the implication was sharp as a blade. Julian felt the familiar sting of being cast as the problem, the disruptor, when all he had done was insist on the seat he had paid for. His eyes narrowed just slightly, a flicker of steel in his calm demeanor. "If you believe I should be removed," he said slowly, "then I suggest you first call someone with actual decision-making authority. Not a flight attendant, not security. Someone who understands contracts." Clara hesitated. She wasn't accustomed to passengers demanding higher authority. Usually, the mere mention of security was enough to end resistance. She glanced at Ethan Park, whose nervous shifting betrayed his discomfort. Ethan avoided Julian's eyes, looking down at the gleaming floor, as though the pattern of wood grain could offer an escape. Julian's voice softened, but the calmness carried a weight that could not be dismissed. Call your supervisor, or better yet, your operations manager, because this will not be resolved by intimidation. From somewhere behind, a phone camera clicked audibly as someone began filming in earnest. Another passenger muttered, "Good for him." Victoria leaned closer to Clara, whispering, though her words carried, "He's turning this into a scene. I told you, he doesn't belong here." Julian's chest rose and fell slowly, his mind steadying itself. For years, he had handled billion-dollar negotiations, mergers that would collapse or flourish depending on a single clause. He knew the art of pressure. He knew when to let silence hang and when to cut through it like a scalpel. Now, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and, with deliberate precision, dialed a number. Every motion was visible to the cabin. His thumb moved unhurriedly, as if time belonged to him alone. "Rachel," he said into the phone, his tone carrying across the first-class cabin. "It's Julian. Patch in legal and start recording. We're documenting an incident on Sky Continental Flight 982. Confirmed seat 2A has been denied, boarding pass challenged, and identification demanded without cause." Murmurs rippled through the rows. Victoria froze, the confident smirk faltering. Clara's professional veneer cracked for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting toward Ethan. Julian lowered the phone slightly, covering the mic, his gaze fixed on Clara. "In the next 3 minutes, you will hear from someone who outranks both you and your captain. And when that happens, understand that I offered you the chance to resolve this with dignity." Ethan swallowed hard, his face pale. "Mr. Carter, maybe we can sort this quietly." Julian cut him off gently. "Ethan, quiet resolution was possible 20 minutes ago. Now it's escalation." The phone beeped, and Rachel Owens's crisp voice came through, amplified enough that nearby passengers could hear. "Julian, I've got legal counsel on the line. Do you want me to patch in corporate as well?" "Yes," Julian said evenly. "And connect me directly with Daniel Harrington. Tell him I'm seated in 2A and his crew has challenged my right to occupy the seat I purchased." The name dropped like a weight into the air. Daniel Harrington, CEO of Sky Continental, a man whose decisions rippled through the aviation industry. Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. One mouthed to another, "Did he just say the CEO?" Victoria scoffed, though her tone had lost its edge. "You're bluffing." Julian turned his eyes to her, calm and unyielding. "The thing about power," he said, "is that it doesn't need to shout. It simply acts." Clara took a step back, clutching her crew logbook. She felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the rules of the familiar cabin suddenly collapsing. She had been trained to handle complaints, upgrades, even belligerent passengers, but not this, not a man who spoke like a boardroom chair. The phone beeped again. Rachel's voice was sharp. "Julian, I have Harrington's office on the line. He's been briefed. He's asking for you directly." Julian pressed speaker. The cabin filled with the low timbre of Daniel Harrington's voice. "Julian, what's going on?" Passengers craned their necks. The cabin crew froze, every muscle taut. "Daniel," Julian said, his tone steady, every syllable a hammer strike. "I boarded your flight with a confirmed seat assignment in 2A. Your staff denied my seat, demanded unnecessary identification, and attempted to reassign me to premium economy while prioritizing another passenger based solely on appearance." The silence afterward was suffocating. Then Harrington's voice, low but resolute. "Understood. I'll have the flight grounded until this is addressed. Stay on the line." The words detonated in the cabin. Ethan's tablet buzzed with a sudden alert. His eyes widened as he read the screen. "We've been ordered to return to the gate." A ripple of shock coursed through the cabin. Victoria shot up from her seat, nearly spilling her champagne. "What? This is ridiculous over a seat dispute." Julian said nothing. He simply sat down in 2A, fastened his seatbelt, and rested his hands calmly on his knees. He looked for all the world like a man in control of time itself. Clara stumbled for words, her polished tone faltering. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience. The aircraft will return to the gate to resolve an internal matter." From row 5, a young man called out, "That's not an inconvenience. That's justice." His phone camera pointed squarely at Victoria, who recoiled, her cheeks flushing. She turned to Clara, panic edging into her voice. "Do something! He can't! He can't! Just!" But Clara said nothing. The balance of power had shifted beyond her reach. Julian's phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. A second call was coming through, patched from Rachel. He answered, placing it on speaker. A brisk female voice filled the cabin. "Mr. Carter, this is Patricia Hale, Vice President of Operations. We want to extend our apologies. Effective immediately. The attendants involved will be suspended pending investigation, and the passenger occupying your seat will be placed on our permanent no-fly list." Gasps erupted from several rows. Victoria's face drained of color, her hand trembling around the stem of her glass. "You can't do that," she cried, voice cracking. Patricia continued firmly, "This directive comes from executive leadership. We will also be implementing bias and anti-discrimination training across all flight crews, effective immediately." Julian gave a small nod, his voice calm. "I'll ensure Collins Aviation oversees the design of that training. You'll hear from us formally by tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir," Patricia said. "Again, our apologies." The line clicked off. The cabin felt like the aftermath of a storm, silent, unsettled, yet charged with the knowledge that something irreversible had just occurred. Julian leaned back in his seat. Around him, passengers held their phones higher, capturing every detail. An older black woman in row 4 whispered, "Thank you," her voice breaking with emotion. Julian gave her a brief nod. Not triumph, not gloating, just acknowledgement. This was never about winning. It was about standing firm in the truth that dignity had no price. Outside, the engine slowed, the aircraft beginning its slow taxi back to the terminal. For the first time since he boarded, Julian allowed himself a deep breath. He knew the storm ahead would be larger still: media, investors, perhaps even lawsuits. But he also knew the die had been cast. The seat was his, and so was the principal. And principals, unlike seats, could never be reassigned. The jet bridge door opened with a metallic groan, letting in a gust of stale terminal air. Passengers rose slowly, reluctant to move, as though leaving the cabin too soon might break the fragile silence still hanging there. No one wanted to miss a moment of what had just unfolded. Julian unbuckled his seatbelt, smoothed his polo, and stood. Every motion was deliberate. He retrieved his leather bag from the overhead compartment with unhurried calm, placing it neatly on the floor. The sight of his quiet composure contrasted sharply with Victoria's frantic movements. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she shoved her Louis Vuitton luggage back into place. The sparkle of entitlement that had lit her eyes at boarding had vanished, replaced with the desperate darting gaze of someone who had lost control of her own story. At the front of the aircraft, 2 ground supervisors waited. One wore a gray suit with an ID badge clipped prominently to his pocket. His voice was steady, rehearsed, but tinged with anxiety. "Mr. Carter, we're here to escort you. The operations office has arranged a private room." Julian raised a hand lightly, his tone even. "Save the apologies for the official report. Send it to Collins Aviation by 5 p. Today. Verbatim." The supervisor swallowed hard, nodding repeatedly. Passengers within earshot widened their eyes. Collins Aviation. The connection clicked in their minds. This was no ordinary passenger. Behind Julian, Clara and Ethan followed with heads bowed. Their polished uniforms, once symbols of authority, now felt like scarlet letters. Clara's hands clutched the logbook as though it could anchor her, but each step was heavy, dragged by the awareness of dozens of cameras recording her fall from grace. And then came Victoria, flanked by 2 airport security officers. She tried to keep her chin high, but her steps were hurried, fueled not by confidence, but by the urge to escape the lenses trained on her. Her Hermes bag dangled awkwardly from her arm, her perfectly styled hair now unraveling strand by strand. In the concourse, passengers from other flights had already gathered, drawn by the ripple of whispers and the sight of phones raised high. Someone shouted, "That's him, the guy from 2A." A wave of murmurs surged through the crowd. Hashtags were already forming before Julian's shoes touched the polished tile floor. He walked with calm precision, every step echoing like a drumbeat. Reporters who happened to be in the terminal rushed forward, recorders outstretched. One called loudly, "Mr. Carter, do you have a comment on being treated like a fraud by your own airline?" Julian paused for a moment, turning toward the nearest camera lens. His voice carried, clear and measured. If this can happen to me, someone with the power to challenge it, then how many times has it happened to those without a voice? The real question isn't why did they do this to me? The question is, what will we do to ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else? The words struck like a spark in dry timber. Within minutes, the quote blazed across social media platforms. Passengers who had filmed inside the cabin uploaded their clips, each one adding fuel to the growing fire. By the time Julian reached the small conference room arranged by VIP services, his name was already trending. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter. A flat-screen monitor glowed on the wall. Rachel Owens appeared via video, flanked by the legal and PR teams of Collins Aviation. Her tone was brisk, efficient, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of pride. "Julian, the footage is everywhere. 32 million views on Twitter in under 3 hours. Hashtag Seat 2A is in the global top 10. Julian lowered himself into a chair at the head of the table. He set his phone on the polished surface, fingers steepled. This isn't just a viral story, it's an indictment. We're not going to let it fade as entertainment. One lawyer leaned forward. Do we sue? Do we settle? What's our move? Julian's gaze was steady. Start with Sky Continental. Demand mandatory anti-bias training. Changes to boarding policy so status can't override a paid seat. And the creation of a discrimination complaint hotline. If they agree, we support. If not, we sell our shares. Rachel scribbled notes, her pen moving fast, and the media. Julian's mouth curved into a faint smile. We don't need to run a campaign. The story will tell itself. The people recording in that cabin, they've already made it bigger than us. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since stepping on board, he allowed a trace of weariness to seep into his expression. Not defeat, but the deep awareness of what he had unleashed. He knew this wasn't just about one flight, one seat, one humiliation. It was about a pattern older than the airline itself, a pattern that had to be broken. Outside, the PA system called another boarding group for another flight, the ordinary rhythm of the airport resuming as if nothing had changed. But for Julian, nothing would ever be ordinary again. Hours later, he left the airport through a private exit. By then, news anchors were already dissecting the incident live on television. One clip looped again and again, Julian's calm face, his quiet words. Principles have no price. Commentators debated whether he had been targeted unfairly, whether the airline's response was enough, whether this was the start of a reckoning. At Collins Aviation's Chicago headquarters, a war room had been set up. Screens tracked view counts, hashtags, and global media coverage. Rachel stood at the center, directing the flow of information like a conductor. We have investor calls lining up. Some want reassurance, others want in on what they're calling the Carter Protocol. By midnight, Julian sat in his high-rise apartment overlooking the glittering skyline. He poured himself a glass of water, staring at the city lights reflected in the glass. His mind replayed the words hurled at him. You don't belong. Check back at the gate. You don't even look like you can afford first class. The insults cut deep, sharper because they were familiar. He had heard them in boardrooms, whispered in lobbies, written in looks cast his way. And yet, in this moment, the pain was matched by resolve. He leaned against the balcony railing, the wind tugging at his shirt. His inner voice wrestled with itself. Was it too much? To ground a flight? To suspend careers? To escalate so far? A whisper of doubt crept in. What if people thought he abused his power? What if they said he turned a personal insult into a corporate weapon? But then the counter voice rose, strong and unyielding. If he hadn't stood firm, the humiliation would have been normalized again. If he had quietly moved to another seat, passengers would have forgotten by landing. Instead, they would remember. The world would remember. His phone buzzed. Rachel again. Julian, CNN just ran a segment. They're calling this the Seat 2A effect. Julian let the words sink in. A term, a brand, a movement, born not from strategy, but from principle. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow carried by the night air. This won't just be a moment. It'll be the start of a standard. Below, the city pulsed with neon light and endless noise. Somewhere in that sprawl, millions of strangers were hearing his name for the first time, attaching it to the idea that dignity was not for sale. And Julian knew there was no going back. The gate had closed behind him, and ahead lay only forward. Morning light broke over Chicago, spilling across the skyline and glinting off the glass towers of Collins Aviation headquarters. Inside the 47th floor strategy room, the atmosphere was electric. Every screen on the wall was alive with graphs, hashtags, and live news tickers. Clips from Flight 982 replayed on loop, each frame dissected by analysts and anchors. Julian Carter walked in without fanfare. He wore a navy suit now, the kind that erased any doubt about who he was. The casual traveler who had boarded in jeans and a polo was gone. In his place stood the executive who had built an empire from one leased aircraft into a global investment firm that shaped the future of aviation. Rachel Owens looked up from her laptop. Julian, it's everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, more than 40 million views in 12 hours. Your Seat 2A is global. Even BBC and Al Jazeera have picked it up. He nodded slowly, scanning the feeds. Each clip told the same story: a man denied dignity, a calm refusal to yield, and the explosive revelation that he wasn't just a passenger, he was the airline's largest shareholder. One of the lawyers spoke up. The legal risk to Sky Continental is massive. They violated DOT regulations, denied a paid seat, demanded extra ID after boarding. This isn't just PR. This could trigger federal review. Julian folded his hands on the table. Good. Then we give them a choice. Either reform with us or collapse under their own weight. Across the city, Sky Continental's headquarters was in chaos. Emergency meetings had been running since dawn. Daniel Harrington, the airline's CEO, sat at the head of a mahogany conference table, his tie loosened, eyes red from a sleepless night. In front of him, the PR director shuffled papers nervously. Daniel, trending hashtags, negative press, investor calls it spiraling. Stock futures are already down 7%. If this continues, we could lose billions in valuation by next week. Daniel slammed his palm against the table. One seat, one damn seat, and they're turning it into an indictment of the whole airline. The PR director hesitated. It's not just a seat, sir. It's the symbolism. People see it as proof that bias shapes who belongs in first class. And the fact that it was Carter. The room fell into silence at the mention of Julian's name. Everyone knew what it meant. Collins Aviation wasn't just an investor. It was leveraged billions in contracts, technology partnerships, leasing agreements. Back in Chicago, Julian leaned against the long conference table, his eyes sweeping across his own team. We don't gloat. We don't posture. We lead. Draft a statement Collins Aviation will partner with Sky Continental if and only if they commit to 3 reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training for all frontline staff, a no-status override rule for confirmed tickets, and a real-time discrimination complaint hotline monitored by executives. Rachel's pen flew across her notebook. And if they refuse, Julian's voice was like tempered steel. Then we divest immediately, and we let the market see why. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the hum of the screens. Then one of the younger analysts spoke, almost in awe. Julian, if they cave, this becomes the Carter standard. Every airline will follow just to avoid being the next viral story. Julian didn't smile. He simply nodded. That's the point. By noon, phones across the building were buzzing nonstop. Investors wanted reassurance. Some were cautious, worried about volatility. Others were hungry, sensing an opportunity. A hedge fund partner called in, his voice booming through the speakerphone. Julian, if you're turning this into an industry-wide reform campaign, we'll double our position in Collins Aviation. He responded evenly. This isn't about opportunism, it's about risk management. Discrimination isn't just a moral failure, it's a brand liability. Every company will understand that soon enough. That afternoon, a press conference unfolded in the terminal at O'Hare. Dozens of reporters crowded behind velvet ropes. Julian appeared at the podium, Rachel standing just behind him. Flashbulbs exploded as questions rained down. Mr. Carter was grounding the flight an overreaction. His reply was measured, his cadence steady. On-time departures are important, but respect for paying customers is more important. If rules are applied selectively based on appearance, then the rules mean nothing. Another reporter shouted, "Are you using this to increase Collins Aviation's power?" Julian allowed himself the faintest smile. Yes, power is a tool, and a tool can be used for profit or for fairness. I choose both. The soundbite ricocheted across networks within minutes. Commentators debated whether it was brilliance or arrogance, but either way, it spread like wildfire. Later that night, Julian sat alone in his apartment. The city glowed below, a sea of lights reflecting on the dark river. His phone buzzed again and again with messages from allies, rivals, and strangers. Some congratulated him, others warned him. He poured himself a glass of water, staring out over the skyline. The inner conflict churned quietly beneath his calm surface. Had he gone too far, should he have handled it quietly? Without grounding an entire flight, the whisper of doubt pressed against him. Maybe people would call it an abuse of power. But then another thought rose, sharper, steadier. What if he had done nothing? What if he had moved to another seat? Let the insult stand by now. Everyone would have forgotten. No videos, no conversation, no change. Just another humiliation buried. He set the glass down with a firm clink against the countertop. No, he murmured to himself. This had to happen. It had to be seen. Across the Atlantic, in London, a late-night news program ran the headline, "The Seat 2A Effect. Can one man force airlines to face their biased guests?" Debated whether Julian was hero or opportunist. Either way, his name was on every screen. Back in Sky Continental's headquarters, Daniel Harrington leaned back in his chair, exhausted. His legal chief looked at him grimly. "Sir, if Carter pulls his investment, we won't survive the market backlash. We need to meet his terms." Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of inevitability pressing down. He had spent his career believing airlines controlled passengers. Today, the balance had shifted. One passenger, one shareholder, had turned the system upside down. By midnight, Rachel called Julian again. Her tone carried a mix of urgency and triumph. "They're ready to negotiate. They'll accept all 3 reforms." Julian stared out at the city lights, his reflection a shadow in the glass. His inner voice, weary but resolute, answered her silently, "This is just the beginning." The storm had broken beyond the cabin, sweeping across boardrooms, headlines, and trading floors. But Julian knew storms weren't just destruction. They cleared the air, they changed the landscape. And when the clouds lifted, nothing would look the same again. The boardroom of Sky Continental's headquarters in Dallas looked more like a war bunker than a place of strategy. Screens lined the walls, glowing with red graphs that told a story of panic-plunging stock prices, plummeting satisfaction scores, and a social media storm that refused to die down. At the head of the long oak table sat Daniel Harrington, the CEO. His shoulders sagged under the fluorescent lights, his jaw tight as though he had been chewing the same problem for hours without release. The rest of the board filled the seats around him, faces gray with fatigue, but eyes sharp with blame. One director spoke, her voice cutting through the thick air. "We can't hold this line any longer. The market doesn't care about excuses. They see bias, humiliation, and mishandling. They see us. Unless we move decisively, we're finished." Daniel's lips pressed into a hard line. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew the truth. He had seen the videos too, the flight attendant demanding extra ID, the passenger sneering that Julian didn't belong, the calm refusal, and then the thunderclap. "I am Julian Carter, your largest shareholder." No PR statement could erase that. "Have we heard from Carter?" another board member asked. Daniel exhaled. "Yes. 3 demands. Bias training, no status overrides, and a hotline. He wants us to let his firm oversee implementation." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some were relieved, others bristled. "That's an admission of guilt." One man muttered, "We let him control the narrative." Another countered, "He already controls the narrative. Every news anchor in the country is quoting him." Silence followed. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but the truth was, simple Julian Carter had grounded more than just a flight. He had grounded their entire authority. Across the country in Chicago, Julian sat in his own boardroom at Collins Aviation. His team was assembled, but the mood was different, focused, hungry. Rachel Owens scrolled through her notes. "Harrington's team is fractured. Half want to fight, half want to fold. Either way, they'll have to talk to us within 48 hours. Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. He had expected resistance, but the scale of the collapse surprised even him. The viral tide hadn't slowed, it had deepened. Hashtags had shifted from the Seat 2A to Respect Before Profit and Fair Skies. Each new wave brought more stories from passengers around the world, denied check-ins, downgraded rooms, biased confrontations. The incident had become a mirror, reflecting every prejudice people had buried. He leaned forward, speaking quietly. "We won't negotiate like supplicants. They need us more than we need them. But we also don't humiliate. If this is going to last, It has to feel like reform, not revenge. For a moment, the room was still. Then Rachel asked the question everyone avoided. Julian, are you certain you want this fight to go global once we step past airlines? There's no going back. His gaze drifted to the window, where the city skyline cut against the afternoon sun. He thought of that moment on the plane standing, ticket in hand, being told he didn't belong. The weariness that had pressed into his chest, the memory of his father, years ago, denied entry to a country club despite being a paying guest. The same script, recycled across generations. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. We're already past that point. They dragged us here. The only question is whether we stand still or lead. The following morning, Julian flew to Dallas on a private jet. No fanfare, no cameras, just Rachel by his side, a folder of contracts in her hands. As they landed, she glanced at him. They'll expect compromise. Are you willing to give them any? Julian's reply was measured. Compromise on timelines, perhaps, but not on principles. Principles have no price. The words hung in the air like a vow. At Sky Continental headquarters, security escorted them to the top floor. The board was already waiting. Cameras had been banned from the room, but every face was tense with the awareness that history was being written within these walls. Daniel Harrington stood to greet him, though the gesture felt more like necessity than respect. Mr. Carter, thank you for coming. Julian shook his hand, firm but not overly long. Daniel. He took his seat at the far end of the table, Rachel beside him, her pen poised above her notebook. The negotiations began formally, but quickly turned raw. A board member tried to minimize. This was one flight, one incident. We can't let it dictate policy for an entire airline. Julian's reply was sharp, each word deliberate. It wasn't one incident. It was the incident you saw. How many more happened without a camera? How many passengers moved to another seat, swallowed the insult, and stayed silent? This isn't about one flight. It's about every flight. Another director leaned forward. And, if we agree, what's next? Hotels, restaurants. Where does it stop? Julian's gaze cut across the table. It stops when respect is the rule, not the exception. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. Let's talk terms. The 3 demands were laid out, simple on paper, but seismic in impact. Training for all staff, overseen by Collins Aviation. A no-status override rule, eliminating the hidden hierarchy that had excused Victoria Langford's entitlement. And a hotline, monitored by executives to track every complaint in real time. The board balked at the oversight clause. You're asking us to let you control our operations, one said, his voice rising. Julian didn't flinch. No. I'm asking you to control them yourselves. I'm offering the framework. Whether you succeed or fail depends on you. Rachel slid the draft contract across the table. The board members scanned it, their expressions shifting from defiance to unease. The clauses were ironclad. Breaches would trigger immediate penalties, including public disclosure. Daniel exhaled heavily. You're leaving us no room. Julian's voice was quiet but unyielding. That's because dignity leaves no room for negotiation. The hours stretched. Coffee grew cold. Arguments flared and died. But slowly, the weight of inevitability pressed down. By evening, the board signed. The reforms would be implemented immediately, with Collins Aviation named as strategic oversight partner. As pen scratched across paper, Julian felt a ripple of conflicting emotions. Victory, yes, but also gravity. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about millions of travelers who would never know his name, but would feel the shift in invisible ways, a seat honored, an ID not demanded, a smile given without suspicion. After the meeting, Daniel lingered. His voice was lower now, almost weary. Julian, you've forced our hand, but you've also forced the industries. Do you realize what you've started? Julian met his eyes. I didn't start it, Daniel. It started every time someone was told they didn't belong. I'm just refusing to let it stay hidden. He left the building that night with Rachel, the Texas sky wide above them. Reporters waited at the gates, but Julian didn't stop for statements. His work was only beginning. On the flight home, Rachel finally allowed herself a small smile. You know they'll call this the Carter Accord. 3 reforms, signed under pressure. It's already history. Julian leaned back in his seat, staring at the stars outside the window. He felt the familiar tug of doubt. Would it stick, or would it dissolve like so many corporate pledges before? But beneath that doubt was a firmer resolve, forged in every insult he had endured and every silence he had refused to accept. History isn't written by promises, he said quietly. It's written by what happens when the cameras are gone. Rachel looked at him, then nodded. She knew what he meant. This wasn't a finish line. It was the starting gate. And somewhere deep inside, Julian knew the storm was far from over. It was only gathering strength, ready to leap from airlines to every corner of the service world. The fight was no longer about a single seat. It was about rewriting the rules of belonging. The morning after the accord was signed, Dallas woke up to headlines that blared across every screen. Sky Continental Grounds, flight over bias scandal. Airline signs, historic reform deal with largest shareholder. The Carter Accord. Television anchors replayed the footage from Flight 447 again and again. Julian standing calmly in the aisle, ticket in hand, the flight attendant demanding extra ID. Victoria Langford sneering about who belonged in first class. Then the sudden shift to the phone call, the CEO's voice echoing through the cabin, and the order to return to the gate. Each replay seemed to fuel the storm rather than calm it. At O'Hare Airport, passengers waiting to board their flights gathered around television screens mounted above the gates. Some clapped when Julian's name was mentioned. Others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering that it should never have come to this. At LaGuardia, a gate agent quietly tucked a printout of Julian's quote into her pocket. Dignity leaves no room for negotiation. In Chicago, the Collins Aviation offices buzzed with energy. Rachel Owens stood at the center of the strategy room, directing her team as though they were conducting an orchestra. Analysts tracked mentions of the Carter Accord across Twitter, LinkedIn, and cable news. The numbers climbed so fast, the graphs looked like rocket launches. Julian, you're trending #1 worldwide, Rachel said, scrolling through the reports. Over 40 million posts in the last 12 hours. Julian sat at the head of the table, posture steady, face composed. But inside, a knot tightened. He had expected backlash, yes, but not this tidal wave of attention. His private fight for one seat had become a public symbol overnight. He asked quietly, and the sentiment Rachel replied without hesitation. 80% positive. People see you as the man who forced accountability. But there's 20% calling you arrogant, saying you embarrassed the airline for personal pride. Julian gave a faint smile, one without joy. Symbols always divide. Later that afternoon, CNN requested a live interview. Julian hesitated. He wasn't a politician, and he despised posturing, but refusing might look evasive. Rachel urged him. This is your chance to shape the narrative before someone else does. Under studio lights, the anchor leaned forward. Mr. Carter, many are calling this the Carter Accord, a landmark for passengers' rights. Did you anticipate this scale when you stood your ground on that plane? Julian answered slowly, choosing his words with precision. I didn't anticipate anything beyond sitting in the seat I paid for, but what happened revealed something deeper that bias doesn't stop at the boarding door. It's woven into how people are judged, treated, and dismissed. If my experience forced us to confront that, then I'll accept the responsibility. The anchor pressed. Critics say you used your power as a shareholder to humiliate an airline for your own gain. What do you say to them? Julian's eyes met the camera. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. If defending your dignity is called humiliation, then the definition is broken. And if reforming a company you partly own is self-interest, then let every shareholder use their power the same way, because dignity should never be negotiable. The clip went viral within the hour. By evening, late-night hosts were quoting him. Hashtags like dignity, not negotiable, and Carter Accord surged to the top of global trends, but not everyone celebrated. In Washington, Senator Malcolm Grant slammed his fist on the desk as he watched the coverage. "He's destabilizing the economy," the senator muttered to his aide. "If every CEO starts making moral crusades, the service industry will collapse under scrutiny." At Sky Continental's headquarters, Daniel Harrington watched the same broadcast with a mixture of relief and resentment. Julian had saved the airline's reputation from total implosion, but he had also branded it with his name. The Carter Accord would forever remind people not of Sky Continental's leadership, but of its failure to lead. Meanwhile, passengers around the world began sharing their own stories. A black couple denied entry to a hotel lounge in Paris. A Latino family told their tickets weren't valid despite proof. An Asian businessman treated as suspicious during check-in. Each post carried the same tag, Chapier Seat 2A. The movement had become bigger than Julian, bigger than airlines. It was a rallying cry. One evening, as Julian sat alone in his apartment, the weight of it all pressed down on him. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, but inside he felt the familiar pull of exhaustion. He poured a glass of water, staring at his reflection in the window. He had never sought to be a hero. He had never wanted to be the story. A memory surfaced his father's voice years ago, after being turned away from that country club. "Son, the hardest part isn't standing tall. It's carrying the silence of those who couldn't." Julian exhaled. That silence now echoed louder than ever. The next morning, Rachel entered his office with a thick folder. "Requests," she said simply. "Hotels, restaurants, even a shipping conglomerate. They all want to adopt what they're calling the Carter Protocol." Julian raised an eyebrow. Already, she nodded. The boardroom in Dallas was just the beginning. "You've started a movement whether you like it or not." He flipped through the proposals, each stamped with urgency. He felt the pull of two opposing forces, one voice whispering to rest, to step back before the tide swallowed him, and another urging him forward, to strike while the world was watching. "Rachel," he said finally, "if we do this, it can't be a PR stunt. No glossy posters, no empty pledges, real change or nothing." She smiled faintly. "That's why people believe you." That evening, at a press conference in Chicago, Julian addressed the world. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras clicking like 1,000 shutters in unison. "I didn't ask for the Carter Accord," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't ask for hashtags or headlines, but I will not ignore them either. If bias can undermine one seat, it can undermine trust everywhere. Airlines, hotels, restaurants, every service industry that depends on trust must be held accountable. Starting today, Collins Aviation will expand the Carter Protocol beyond airlines. Fairness will not stop at the cabin door." Applause broke out, but Julian barely heard it. He felt the immense weight of what he had just declared. The battle had moved from one airline to the global stage, and the fight would only grow harsher from here. That night, back in his apartment, he sat again by the window, phone buzzing endlessly with notifications, messages of support, threats from those who feared change, invitations from governments, corporations, universities. The noise was deafening, but beneath it all, he heard the same quiet vow that had carried him through Flight 447. Principles have no price, and he knew the storm was only beginning. The Carter Accord had barely settled into the public consciousness when the storm clouds began to gather. Not the applause, not the hashtags, not the applause lines on late-night television. Those were already expected. It was the quiet meetings behind closed doors, the whispered phone calls, the subtle shifts in tone from allies who suddenly sounded more cautious than supportive. Senator Malcolm Grant was the first to act openly. In a televised committee hearing on transportation, he leaned forward, his jowls tight, his voice dripping with a practiced authority. When unelected executives use their private influence to disrupt national carriers, he thundered, they risk destabilizing not only commerce but confidence in the entire travel sector. Mr. Carter may mean well, but his so-called accord sets a dangerous precedent. We cannot let one man dictate the policies of an entire industry. Clips of the speech flashed across the evening news. Commentators debated whether Julian Carter was a reformer or a rogue, a pioneer or a problem. One network anchor mused aloud, "Is Julian Carter protecting passengers, or is he using personal power to wage a crusade that could topple the service economy as we know it?" Julian watched the broadcast alone in his Chicago apartment, remote in hand, the glow of the television casting harsh shadows across his face. For the first time, he felt the question sink into his bones. Was he destabilizing the system? Was his insistence on principle too uncompromising? He stood and paced the length of the living room, replaying the words in his head. Dangerous precedent. One man dictating. The echo grated against his sense of balance. He had built his career by negotiating, by making deals that left both sides standing. But this was different. Rachel Owens found him still pacing when she arrived late that evening with a folder of updates. She took one look at his expression and set the papers down carefully. "You saw the hearing," she said softly. Julian nodded, his jaw tightening. "He painted me as a tyrant, and people will believe it." Rachel crossed her arms, steady but firm. "Some will, most won't. The ones who've lived through bias know exactly why you stood your ground. Don't let one senator's speech rewrite your truth." Julian sank onto the sofa, rubbing his temples. "Rachel, I never wanted this scale. A protocol for fairness? Yes, but now governments, alliances, global industries calling me a destabilizer." Rachel sat across from him. "Do you remember what your father told you back when you started Collins Aviation? That once you plant a flag on principle, you can't move it every time the wind changes." Julian let out a slow breath. He remembered. He also remembered his father's weary eyes, the price he had paid for never bending, the doors forever closed. The next morning, as if to confirm his unease, a confidential memo landed on Rachel's desk. Stamped with the seal of the Global Service Alliance, it outlined a coordinated plan to curb and contain the Carter Protocol. The Alliance, a coalition of luxury hotel groups, restaurant conglomerates, and international carriers, demanded that all evaluation and certification measures be subject to their independent council. A council made up, of course, of their own executives. Rachel stormed into Julian's office, the folder clutched in her hand. "They're trying to box us in," she said, dropping the papers on his desk. "If you agree, they'll control every certification. Seat 2A becomes a sticker they can slap on their ads whenever it suits them. If you refuse, they'll blacklist us from their networks." Julian flipped through the memo, each line stiff with corporate arrogance, his brow furrowed deeper with every page. "They want my signature on surrender," he muttered. "Exactly," Rachel said, "and if you give it, this movement dies before it lives." That evening, the weight bore down heavier. Alone again. Julian stood on his balcony overlooking the river. The city hummed with life below, indifferent to the storm gathering above its skyline. He gripped the railing, his thoughts spiraling. He had the wealth, the influence, the platform, but did he have the stamina? Could one man carry the burden of shifting an entire system that had thrived on bias for centuries? His phone buzzed. A message from his mother, brief but piercing. "Proud of you. Don't let them buy what cannot be sold." He exhaled, a long, trembling breath. That single line steadied him. The next morning, Julian convened an emergency meeting in the 52nd floor conference room. The board of Collins Aviation filled the long table, their expressions a mix of determination and unease. Screens on the wall projected charts of social media sentiment, news coverage, and investor reactions. Julian stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "We're at a crossroads," he began. "If we give in to the alliance, Seat 2A becomes decoration easy to market, meaningless in practice. If we refuse, we risk blacklists, boycotts, maybe billions in lost revenue." The room was silent. Board members exchanged glances, none wanting to be the first to speak. Finally, one older director cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, principle is admirable, but the alliance holds enormous leverage. A boycott could crush us." Julian's gaze was steady, his voice low but unyielding. If principle folds at the first sign of pressure, it was never principle at all. "We didn't start this to decorate brochures. We started this because fairness has no price." Rachel's eyes met his, and she gave the faintest nod. After the meeting, she caught him in the hallway. "You know this won't just be business anymore, right? This is going to be war." Julian paused, his reflection in the glass wall staring back at him. "Then we fight a different kind of war, not in boardrooms alone, but in the light of public truth." Within weeks, he unveiled a bold counterstrike, the Service Fairness Index, a global ranking, publicly released, naming and scoring service brands on their compliance with the Carter Protocol. For the first time, customers could see which companies upheld fairness and which failed, complete with data, video evidence, and independent audits. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Newspapers called it the most radical act of corporate transparency in a generation. Stocks of poorly ranked companies plunged. Shareholders demanded answers. The alliance scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Julian had rewritten the rules of engagement. At home that night, however, the victory felt muted. Julian sat in silence, a glass of water untouched at his side. He knew each bold move only escalated the stakes. He could feel the eyes of enemies sharpening against him. The senator, the alliance, countless unseen figures in boardrooms worldwide, each waiting for him to stumble. He closed his eyes, hearing his father's voice once more. "The hardest part isn't standing tall. It's carrying the silence of those who couldn't," Julian whispered into the empty room, as though making a vow to the night itself. Principles have no price, and with that, he knew he would not bend. The Service Fairness Index detonated like a bomb across the service economy. Within 48 hours of its release, headlines screamed from every continent. Carter Protocol sparks shareholder revolt. Luxury hotel brands face customer exodus. Seat 2A report wipes billions from market value. For customers who had long felt the sting of quiet prejudice at front desks, ticket counters, or boarding gates, the index was liberation. Finally, someone had quantified what they had endured in silence. Social media overflowed with personal testimonies. A black couple in Paris posted video of being told their dinner reservation had mysteriously vanished. A Latina business traveler in Houston shared an email where her confirmed suite was reassigned to another guest with a higher loyalty status. Each story tagged "Eastern Truth." Has no price added fuel to the fire. But for corporate executives, the index was a declaration of war. Overnight, entire PR departments went into crisis mode. Lawyers drafted furious statements accusing Julian Carter of libel, defamation, and reckless judgment. Stockholders demanded board meetings, and at the center of the storm, the Global Service Alliance convened in a marble-lined chamber in Geneva. Around a table polished like a mirror sat some of the most powerful executives in the world. Hotel magnates, airline chiefs, restaurant group presidents, all with portfolios worth billions. At the head sat Malene Duval, CEO of Aurelius Global Hotels, her diamond brooch gleaming under the chandelier. She held up a copy of the index, her manicured finger tapping the red score next to her brand. "This," she said, voice cold and precise, "is an attack. Carter has undermined decades of reputation. He has cost us hundreds of millions in market value. And worse, he has emboldened customers to question us publicly. If we allow this to stand, no brand will ever control its own narrative again." The room murmured agreement. Some argued for a coordinated PR strike, others for lobbying governments to restrict Carter's reach. But Duval leaned forward, eyes flashing. "No, we sue, not for a token amount, but for damages so crushing he will never dare publish another report. We will take him to the International Economic Court in The Hague. $2.3 billion in losses, minimum." The plan was unanimous. Within a week, Julian received the summons. Rachel delivered the thick red folder to his desk, her expression taut. "They filed this morning. Aurelius Global Hotel Group versus Seat 2A Protocol. They're claiming defamation, negligence, and economic sabotage." Julian flipped through the complaint, each page heavier than the last. The words were dressed in legal precision, but the intent was naked: destroy him. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with clarity. He had always known the alliance would strike back. Now the battlefield had shifted to a global court. At night, however, the bravado dimmed. In the quiet of his apartment, Julian lay awake staring at the ceiling. The number haunted him, 2.3 billion. Even for a man of his wealth, it was a figure designed to break him. He imagined headlines branding him reckless, investors fleeing, allies wavering. And beneath it all was the deeper question: could he withstand not just the financial war, but the personal toll? He closed his eyes, hearing again his father's warning from years ago. Principles will cost you more than money. Son, they will cost you peace. The choice is whether you can live without either. The morning after, Julian gathered his team. The 54th floor conference room buzzed with urgency, papers scattered across the table, lawyers speaking in clipped tones. Rachel stood beside him, her face unreadable. Clara Jennings, once the flight attendant who had wronged him and now a surprising ally, sat at the far end of the table, listening intently. Julian raised his voice above the chatter. "This lawsuit is not just about me. It's about the right to speak the truth. If they win, every independent evaluation dies. If we win, the precedent will protect not only Seat 2A, but every watchdog group in every service industry." The room fell silent. Even the lawyers, hardened by years of litigation, looked at him with a measure of respect. They knew this was more than a defense. It was a fight for principle. Preparations consumed the next month. Evidence was gathered, witnesses interviewed, videos cataloged. Customers who had been denied service despite valid bookings came forward in droves. Some sent shaky cell phone recordings of being turned away at counters. Others offered emails and receipts. The pile of proof grew into mountains. Meanwhile, Aurelius launched a counteroffensive in the media. Their CEO appeared on prime-time interviews, accusing Julian of running a profit-driven smear campaign. Glossy ads portrayed smiling concierges and satisfied guests, framing Seat 2A as an unreliable outsider. The public was divided. Hashtags trended both for and against Julian. Investors grew nervous. In private, Julian wrestled with his own doubts. He sat late in his office, staring at the skyline. "What if they're right?" he whispered to himself. "What if I've gone too far? Too fast?" Clara approached him one evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside him and sat down quietly. "I know what it feels like to doubt yourself," she said. "I lived it after Flight 447. I thought I had destroyed my career. But Julian, this isn't about you anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. If you don't fight, who will?" Her words settled into him like an anchor in stormy seas. He took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the warmth ground him. The day of the trial arrived in The Hague. The courtroom was packed. Cameras from 32 countries trained on the proceedings. Julian walked in flanked by Rachel and his legal team. His navy suit pressed, his expression calm but firm. Across the aisle, Malene Duval sat with her lawyers, her presence radiating icy confidence. The plaintiff's case opened with sweeping accusations. They displayed charts of lost revenue, plummeting stock prices, and angry shareholder letters. Their lawyers thundered about Julian's irresponsible data collection and reckless publication of unverified claims. When it was their turn, Julian's lawyers presented video after video. A young couple at a hotel desk showing their confirmed booking only to be told no rooms were available. A black businessman being asked for extra identification while others checked in without question. A family denied access to a lounge despite platinum membership. Each clip played like a mirror to the courtroom, undeniable and raw. Julian himself took the stand on the 3rd day. No notes, no prepared script. His voice carried steady across the chamber. Seat 2A did not cause the damage. We simply revealed it. If the light cost them money, the problem is not the light. The problem is what they tried to keep in the dark. The words reverberated, picked up by every camera, repeated in headlines worldwide. On the final day, his lead counsel delivered the closing blow, Clause 4.3 of the Aurelius contract, which explicitly allowed immediate revocation of certification if discriminatory conduct was documented with verified evidence. They had 20 videos, 112 witness statements, and even an independent report from the United Nations Human Rights Office. The courtroom was silent as the evidence piled higher than any argument Aurelius could mount. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Seat 2A had not defamed, it had fulfilled its duty. The court affirmed the right of independent evaluation organizations to publish transparent information for the public good, even if it harmed profits. Julian sat still as the judgment was read, his hands folded, his face composed, but inside, a flood of relief surged through him. Against billions of dollars and armies of lawyers, the principle had held. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters swarmed. "Mr. Carter, how do you feel after winning a $2.3 billion lawsuit?" shouted one from the BBC. Julian paused, then spoke into the cluster of microphones. "No one wins when fairness has to go to court to defend itself. But today, at least, we preserved the right to tell the truth without asking permission. The clip traveled the globe within hours, sparking new waves of debate and admiration. Hashtags exploded again. Truth has no price trended #1. That night, in his hotel overlooking the Hague Square, Julian sat alone by the window. The streets glowed with warm yellow light. His phone buzzed with messages of congratulations. Investors, allies, friends all celebrating. Yet his thoughts were quieter. Rachel entered and asked gently, "What now?" Julian looked out at the night and answered softly, "Tomorrow we start again. Because if this victory becomes just a moment, it means nothing. It has to be a new standard." He sipped his black coffee, steady once more. Principles, he thought, had no price. The Hague judgment reverberated across the world like a thunderclap. By the time Julian Carter's flight landed back in Chicago, the verdict had already dominated news cycles for 2 straight days. His face appeared on every major network, his words replayed in countless loops. If the light cost them money, the problem is not the light. Some celebrated him as a defender of truth. Others branded him a dangerous disruptor. But no one could ignore him. Seat 2A had not only survived, it had set a precedent. When Julian stepped through the sliding doors at O'Hare, the terminal was a sea of flashing cameras. A few passengers clapped softly as he passed. Others whispered, snapping photos as if documenting the return of a victorious general. He nodded politely but kept moving, flanked by Rachel Owens and Clara Jennings. A black SUV whisked them to Collins Aviation headquarters. On the 52nd floor, the boardroom had transformed into a war room. Screens displayed rolling coverage of the verdict, social media trends, and investor reactions. A red graph showed Aurelia shares plummeting, while another line, bright green, showed Collins Aviation and Seat 2A affiliates climbing steadily. Rachel gestured to the screen. "We've gained 27% in market value since the verdict. Investors see us as untouchable now, but the pressure is higher than ever. Everyone wants in." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were requests from brands across sectors, rail companies in Europe, restaurant groups in Asia, even tech giants wanting their customer support centers audited. Julian skimmed the list, then set it down. "This isn't just growth," he said. "This is a flood, and floods can drown as quickly as they nourish." The room was silent. His words carried weight because he spoke them without triumph. He knew what expansion meant: more scrutiny, more enemies, more chances for the mission to collapse under its own weight. Later that night, Julian sat alone in his office, the city skyline glowing against the glass. The adrenaline of victory had faded, replaced by a gnawing fatigue. He rubbed his temples, thinking of the months of preparation, the sleepless nights, the courtroom tension. For the first time in years, he felt the deep ache of exhaustion in his bones. His phone buzzed, a message from his sister, "Alana, proud of you. Jules, but don't forget to rest. Mom would tell you the same." He smiled faintly at the mention of their late mother, a school teacher who had instilled in him the belief that dignity was non-negotiable. She had always warned him that the world would test his principles. Now he wondered if she had imagined the tests would be this global, this relentless. The next morning, the media frenzy intensified. Headlines spoke of the Carter Doctrine and the new age of corporate accountability. An op-ed in the New York Times called him the man who grounded arrogance. A European financial magazine compared him to regulators who had reshaped entire markets. But not all was praise. Business lobbyists denounced him as reckless. Political commentators accused him of destabilizing economies for personal gain. Senator Malcolm Grant, his longtime critic, appeared on a Sunday talk show declaring, "Julian Carter is not a reformer. He is a vigilante in a suit, wielding economic weapons he was never elected to use. The words stung more than Julian expected. Alone in his office, he replayed the clip. Was Grant right? Had he crossed from reformer to vigilante? The line blurred when principles were tested against profit. He had to remind himself why Seat 2A existed. It had never been about destroying companies. It was about exposing choices. If those choices cost billions, the fault was not his. Rachel found him staring at the screen. "Don't let him shake you," she said. "Grant thrives on fear. You thrive on truth." Julian nodded, though unease lingered. 2 days later, he addressed the Collins aviation staff in the atrium of their headquarters. Hundreds of employees filled the space, some perched on staircases, others watching from balconies. Cameras streamed the speech to affiliates worldwide. He stood at the podium, wearing a simple gray suit. His voice was calm but firm. The Hague verdict was not a victory for me. It was a victory for transparency. It was a statement that fairness is not optional, even when it is costly. But let me be clear, this does not mark the end of our work. It marks the beginning. Applause rippled through the crowd, yet Julian saw in their eyes not only admiration, but fear. They knew what he knew. The larger Seat 2A grew, the harder others would try to tear it down. That evening, he met privately with Clara. She had become one of his most surprising allies, her once defensive posture replaced with humility. "You need to pace yourself," she said gently. "I've seen you carry the weight of this movement on your shoulders. No one can bear it alone." Julian looked at her, recognizing the irony. The woman who once humiliated him in front of a plane full of passengers was now advising him with genuine concern. He let out a tired laugh. Funny how the world turns. Isn't it? Clara didn't smile. "I lost everything once because I clung to the wrong habits. Don't lose everything now because you refuse to let others share the load." Her words struck deeper than she knew. He remembered lying awake in The Hague, wondering if he could withstand the weight. Perhaps she was right. Principles had no price, but they did demand sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice could be shared. The weeks after the trial brought both promise and peril. Bookings surged for hotels and airlines certified under Seat 2A, proving customers valued fairness as much as luxury. Yet the Global Service Alliance plotted in the shadows, preparing new attacks. Whispers of lobbying campaigns and regulatory traps reached Julian's ears. One evening, Rachel entered his office carrying a slim dossier. "We've confirmed it," she said. "The Alliance is pushing lawmakers to require all evaluation systems to be independently verified by councils they control. If they succeed, Seat 2A loses its independence." Julian leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had expected this move. Independence was their greatest strength, and their enemies would do anything to strip it away. He closed the dossier and spoke quietly. "Then we strike first, not with lawsuits, with sunlight. If they want to regulate fairness, let the public see who's behind the curtain." The plan was already forming in his mind. A new report, not just on service fairness, but on the very councils pretending to regulate it. Transparency turned back on the self-proclaimed arbiters. But as he laid out the strategy to Rachel, his chest tightened. The pressure, the sleepless nights, the constant battles, it was beginning to take a toll. He excused himself, stepping out onto the balcony. The night wind brushed his face, cool and sharp. The city lights shimmered below. For the first time, he whispered a question he had never dared aloud. "How much more can I give before the mission consumes me?" He did not know the answer. But he knew one thing with certainty: stepping back was not an option. Not after Flight 447, not after The Hague. Not after millions of people had found hope. In a single phrase, principles have no price. He gripped the railing, drawing strength from the steady hum of the city. Tomorrow the battle would begin anew. Tonight. He allowed himself a single breath of doubt before burying it beneath resolve. The morning light filtered through the glass walls of Collins Aviation's headquarters, painting the strategy room in pale gold. Dozens of analysts, legal experts, and communication staff filled the space, eyes fixed on the large digital board that dominated the wall. Across the top flashed a single phrase, the Service Fairness Index 2.0. Julian Carter stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked weary dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slightly slumped, but his voice carried the same steadiness that had silenced courtrooms and boardrooms alike. "The Global Service Alliance wants to regulate us," he said, scanning the room. "They want to strip Seat 2A of independence and hand power back to the very people we're holding accountable. We won't let that happen. Instead, we'll do what we do best. We'll shine light where they least expect it." Rachel Owens clicked a remote, and the screen shifted. A grid appeared, company logos, council member names, and financial links between regulators and the industries they supposedly oversaw. Gasps rose from the room. Julian let the silence hang before he spoke again. "This isn't just about airlines or hotels anymore. It's about exposing a system built on shadows. We'll publish the report globally, transparent, unfiltered, and we'll let the market decide who still deserves trust." A young analyst at the far end raised his hand. "Sir, if we do this, they'll come after us harder than ever. These aren't just companies. These are governments, billion-dollar alliances. Are we ready for that kind of war?" Julian paused, his eyes locking on the young man. War isn't chosen. Sometimes it arrives at your door. The only choice is whether to open that door standing or kneeling. The room fell quiet. No one argued further. That evening, as the city lights shimmered across the Chicago River, Julian returned to his penthouse apartment. For once, the silence of the space felt suffocating. He loosened his tie, set down his phone, and walked out onto the balcony. The night air was sharp, the hum of traffic below oddly comforting. He thought of his mother again, her small kitchen in Atlanta. The way she'd look at him over the rim of her coffee cup when he was a boy struggling with bullies. "Don't let them define you, Jules," she used to say. "Your worth isn't up for debate." But what if his mission had grown beyond worth and dignity? What if it had become a monster of its own, demanding sacrifice after sacrifice until there was nothing left of him? He felt the ache in his chest, not physical pain, but the weight of expectation pressing down harder every day. His phone buzzed. A message from Clara Jennings. "Don't forget what you told me. Principles have no price. That includes your own well-being." Julian let out a tired laugh. Clara, the woman who once denied him his seat, had become his most unlikely conscience. He typed back a short reply. "Noted, but the fight isn't over yet." The next morning, at exactly 9:00 a.m. Eastern Time, the Service Fairness Index 2.0 went live. It was a digital detonation. The report listed over 150 service brands across aviation, hospitality, retail, and transport. But the real shock came in the second half, a full expose of the Global Service Alliance. The report traced financial conflicts, leaked emails, and documented cases where complaints were quietly buried. For the first time, the regulators themselves were ranked, graded on transparency, bias mitigation, and accountability. One council scored so low that the headline in a London paper read, "Who watches the watchers?" Apparently, Seat 2A. Within hours, hashtag surged. No more shadows. Truth over council. Fairness first. Social media platforms exploded with commentary. Some users shared their own stories of discrimination, tagging companies that had ignored their complaints. Others debated whether Julian had crossed into dangerous territory by naming regulators outright. In Washington, Senator Grant went on television, fury in his voice. Julian Carter has gone too far. He's destabilizing global markets with a personal crusade. This is not reform. It's economic blackmail dressed up as virtue. The words echoed across networks, replayed again and again. And though Julian knew Grant's attacks were expected, he couldn't ignore the sting. That night, the board gathered for an emergency meeting. Rachel laid out the fallout. Aurelius Group's stock dropped another 12%. 2 council members resigned within 24 hours. But on the other side, the alliance is rallying. They've petitioned the UN Commerce Commission to investigate Seat 2A for market manipulation. Julian listened quietly, his face unreadable. When Rachel finished, he stood and walked to the window. The skyline stretched before him, glittering and cold. "We always knew they'd fight back," he said softly. "But the question is, do we believe in what we've built enough to withstand the storm?" The room stayed silent. Then Clara spoke from the corner. "You've already proven that fairness is more valuable than comfort." People are watching. Julian, if you back down now, you'll teach them that fairness has limits. If you keep going, you might break yourself, but you'll prove that the principle is bigger than any one man. Her words hit harder than any analyst report. He turned slowly, meeting her eyes. She meant it not as a challenge, but as a plea. That night, long after everyone else had left. Julian sat alone at the boardroom table. Papers were scattered before him, headlines glowing on multiple screens. His reflection in the glass wall looked older than he felt, as if each battle had carved years from his face. He whispered to himself, the same vow he'd made on that flight months ago. Principles have no price, but then, almost involuntarily, another question followed. What if the price is me? The following week, chaos spread. Some corporations rushed to embrace Seat 2A publicly, posting statements about their commitment to fairness. Others doubled down in opposition, calling Julian a tyrant. Investor calls came in hourly, some offering more money to expand the program, others threatening to pull out if he didn't tone it down. In Zurich, protesters marched outside a luxury hotel holding signs that read Seat 2A or Bust. In New York, lobbyists crowded the steps of Congress, demanding new laws to rein in rogue evaluations. Julian found himself at the center of a storm unlike anything he had faced. And yet, when he appeared on a primetime interview, his voice was steady. The Global Service Alliance thought they could silence Seat 2A by putting us under their control. Instead, they've been exposed. This is not about one seat on one flight anymore. It's about every moment when dignity is questioned, every time bias replaces fairness. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Change should be uncomfortable. The clip went viral, played in boardrooms, classrooms, and even community centers. Support poured in from places Julian had never expected: grassroots movements, student groups, even retired judges who saw the Hague verdict as a line in the sand. But late that night, sitting alone in his apartment, he stared at the city lights and felt the growing weight inside. His hands trembled slightly as he poured a glass of water. He hated admitting it, even to himself. But the question loomed larger than ever. Could he keep this up without losing himself completely? The Hague had been stormy that morning, gray clouds pressing low over the Gothic rooftops. By the time Julian Carter entered the International Economic Forum's main chamber, the air was heavy with anticipation. Delegates from 50 nations filled the semicircle of seats. Rows of journalists and cameras lined the back wall. every lens trained on the man who had become both a hero and a lightning rod. The Global Service Alliance had succeeded in dragging Seat 2A to a formal hearing, framing it as a threat to global markets. Their lawyers argued with polished precision, painting Julian as a corporate vigilante who destabilized industries for personal leverage. But when Julian rose to speak, there was no script in his hand. He stood alone at the center of the chamber, voice calm but cutting. "They call it destabilization," he said, his gaze sweeping across the hall. "But what destabilizes a system more than injustice ignored, what corrodes trust faster than bias hidden under polished branding, if fairness threatens your markets, then your markets were built on sand." A murmur rippled through the delegates. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of his expression. Julian held up a sheet of paper, simple, unadorned. "This is a boarding pass. Seat 2A, a contract, a promise. Months ago, I was told I did not belong in the seat I had purchased. Not because of paperwork, not because of error, but because of perception. That perception almost stood unchallenged, but I refused to yield, and today, millions of people refuse to yield." He lowered the paper. Silence stretched across the chamber, thick as stone. Behind him, Rachel Owens sat at the defense table, her face steady but her eyes shining. Clara Jennings leaned forward, hands clasped tight, as if willing her own strength into him. Julian continued, his voice deepening. "Seat 2A was never just about me. It's about the traveler denied dignity at a hotel counter, the customer overlooked at a restaurant, the student dismissed in a classroom. It's about the countless moments when someone with power decides who belongs and who does not. We cannot legislate dignity, but we can demand accountability." The Alliance's lead attorney stood abruptly, objecting. "Mr. Carter, this forum is about economics, not emotions." Julian turned toward him, eyes like steel. "Then let's talk economics. Bias is the single largest hidden tax on trust. When customers lose faith, they leave. When they leave, markets fall. Seat 2A didn't destabilize the economy. It revealed the instability that was already there." A wave of applause broke out from one section of the chamber, quickly spreading until the room thundered with clapping hands. The Alliance's counsel sat down, their polished composure cracking. By evening, headlines blazed. "Julian Carter stands tall in The Hague. Fairness is non-negotiable." That night, back in his hotel overlooking the canals, Julian sat with Rachel and Clara. The glow of screens lit the room messages from activists, CEOs, even heads of state. Some offered support, others thinly veiled warnings. Rachel scrolled through the flood. "You've ignited something bigger than they ever expected. Some are calling it the Carter Doctrine." Julian smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at the corners of his face. "Doctrines are for politics. This is just a principle." Clara spoke softly. "Principles have no price. You've said it so many times. But I need to ask, how much longer can you carry it alone?" Julian looked at her, then at Rachel. For a moment, he felt the weight of the world pressing down again. His chest ached with the strain of months spent battling boardrooms, alliances, and courts. He thought of the night on the balcony when he'd whispered to himself, "What if the price is me?" He exhaled slowly. "Then I don't carry it alone anymore. Seat 2A doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who refuses to be invisible." The words hung in the air like a vow. Over the next weeks, the ripple became a tide. Airlines, hotels, retailers, and even governments scrambled to align with the Seat 2A protocol. Some did it out of conviction, others out of fear of being exposed. University classes began teaching the Seat 2A effect as a modern case study in corporate ethics. Social media turned Julian's simple boarding pass into a global symbol printed on posters, murals, and protest signs from Johannesburg to Tokyo. But it was not without cost. The Alliance launched counter-campaigns, accusing Seat 2A of corporate overreach. Lawsuits piled up. Lobbyists pushed new bills in Congress. Through it all, Julian remained calm, though the toll was clear to those closest to him. He slept little, his hair flecked more with gray, but his resolve never bent. One evening, months after The Hague, Julian returned to Chicago and found himself standing alone in O'Hare's Terminal 3. Flights roared above, passengers hurried past, but for him, the moment was strangely quiet. He walked to a window overlooking the runway. A plane lifted into the night sky, its lights carving through the dark. He thought back to that first moment, the sting of being told he didn't belong in Seat 2A, how a single insult had set fire to an entire system. He smiled to himself, weary but unbroken. At that moment, a young woman approached hesitantly, holding a boarding pass in her hand. She couldn't have been more than 20, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and gratitude. "Mr. Carter," she asked softly, I just wanted to thank you. Last month, at a hotel in Miami, they tried to deny me a room I'd already paid for. I told them about Seat 2A. I showed them the hotline number, and they fixed it. They treated me with respect. It was the first time I felt like someone had my back. Julian looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn boarding pass, the original from that fateful flight. "Seat 2A." He pressed it into her hand. "This was never mine to keep," he said quietly. "Now it's yours. Carry it forward." Her eyes brimmed with tears as she clutched it to her chest. "I will." Julian watched her walk away, disappearing into the tide of travelers. Then he turned back to the window, the lights of another plane lifting into the sky. He whispered, almost to himself, "Fairness isn't a privilege, it's the default. And as long as I have breath, I'll fight to keep it that way." The next morning, news outlets reported a new surge of support. Hashtags trended again. Mars Seat 2A. No price. Fairness first. And while Julian Carter knew battles still loomed ahead, he also knew the truth. The movement was now larger than him. From one stolen seat on an airplane to the chambers of an international court, the principle had taken flight, and it would not land until fairness was no longer a negotiation, but a given. From a single boarding pass in Seat 2A to the halls of an international court, Dr. Julian Carter proved something the world had long forgotten. Fairness is not a luxury for the privileged, it's a right owed to all. We saw him humiliated, we saw him tested, we saw him fight not with anger, but with resolve. And in his refusal to surrender, he carried millions of unheard voices with him. Yes, this is a story about one man, but it's also a mirror held up to all of us. How many moments of quiet discrimination go unchallenged every day? How many times do we look away because it's easier than standing firm? Julian's words echo still. Principles have no price. That truth is both an indictment of prejudice and an invitation to believe that dignity is non-negotiable, whether in an airplane cabin, a hotel lobby, or anywhere human beings meet. So as we close this chapter, carry the lesson forward. Defend your seat. Defend your worth. Defend the right of every person to be treated with respect. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned, because the fight for dignity doesn't end here. More stories are waiting.